Let me paint out one of the most emotional situations a fight fan can find themselves in. You are at your favorite sports bar, watching one of your favorite fighters fight. Not one of your friends believes they can win, but you do, and you have an unreasonably large bet placed to prove it. Fast forward about 10 minutes later and your favorite fighter has been flatlined, their gloves left in the middle of the cage, and Joe Rogan saying it was an honor to call their fights. Leaving your gloves in the cage has become synonymous with the retirement of an MMA fighter. It's a visual that fight fans understand with no explanation required. But have you ever wondered why or how this has become a tradition in MMA? Well, let me give you my best explanation of how the tradition of retiring fighters leaving their gloves in the cage when retiring started. Let's start with what other combat sports do. In boxing, we don't typically see boxers leaving their gloves in the ring when retiring, maybe because there would literally be no room to do so. However, they do have the term to hang up the gloves, which has well transcended the sport of boxing, especially after Rocky Marciano retired to become a common phrase for retiring or moving on. Muay Thai fighters again don't typically leave their gloves in the ring, but may extend their Wei Kru or symbolically hand their Mongkong and Prajiad / their headbands and armbands back to their teacher. Now, here's where we get to the root of the question with wrestling. In wrestling, there is a tradition which you may recognize, of leaving your shoes on the mat to signify you are retiring. It's not well documented when this first started happening, but by the early 2000s it was relatively commonplace. This tradition was quickly adopted by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners, who some argue actually did this before wrestlers, but they would leave their belts on the mats to symbolize, much like wrestlers, that this was the end of their journey in the competitive side of the sport. So there is our answer. Considering MMA was built on the backs of high-level wrestlers and BJJ practitioners, it's just natural that some of these traditions carried over to MMA. But that leaves the follow-up question, so why do wrestlers leave their shoes on the mat? The roots of the tradition can be traced back to ancient rituals and customs from various combat sports and martial arts. In many cultures, warriors would ceremonially leave behind a part of their gear, such as armor, weapons, or even symbolic attire after their final battle. This act marked the warrior's transition from the role as a fighter to a new stage in life, often signaling the end of their service or combat career. For instance, in ancient Greece and Rome, soldiers and gladiators would sometimes dedicate their armor or weapons to the gods as an offering of thanks for surviving combat. After the Battle of Marathon, in 490 BCE, many Athenian soldiers dedicated their arms to the gods at the Temple of Athena in gratitude for victory and survival. In similar fashion, samurai warriors in feudal Japan passed on their swords or armor to the next generation of samurai after their final battle as a symbolic way to close the chapter of their warrior life. The shedding of gear represented not just the end of physical fighting, but also a deeper spiritual conclusion to the identity of a warrior. Taking us back to modern amateur wrestling, this ancient practice evolved into a symbolic and respectful gesture within the sport. Wrestling, one of the oldest forms of combat known to humanity, carries with it deep traditions of honor, discipline, and sacrifice. By leaving their shoes in the center of the mat, wrestlers pay homage to their journey and the sacrifices they individually and their team face throughout their career. The mat becomes a sacred place where the wrestler can, in a sense, lay down their arms, signifying that they will no longer compete. This act also serves as a gesture of respect to their coaches, teammates, and the sport itself. It acknowledges the time, effort, and dedication invested into wrestling, and the ritual offers a sense of closure for the athlete. It's not just about leaving their shoes behind, it's about leaving behind the identity of being an active competitor and embracing a new phase of life. So there we have it. The relatively simple act of MMA fighters leaving their gloves in the cage has a deep-rooted history tied to the warrior spirit, the passing of the torch, respect for the sport, and those still competing. Personally, I love the tradition. In a sport that rewards trash talking and showboating, and there's nothing wrong with that, it's entertainment at the end of the day, but it's so important that the athletes have an avenue once it's all said and done to give the sport, their coaches, and their fans a final thank you before moving on from the sport.